we're going to be talking about their money, I guess.
Yeah, probably.
Well, let's see if they're. We'll need a spot when we go to this, when we're talking about the additions, to get a motion to add Oceans Day to that. I'll stop when we get to there.
You got a little one
I'm
again?
not sure, just see how far it'll go. Go it all. Okay.
Oh, you're okay.
Well, let's find out why first.
Oh. No, I don't think so.
I think they
They're
have to.
here to ask questions.
Okay. Got 2 minutes for the clock over there, but the library opened at 1 o'clock, so I assume their clock said 1 o'clock. So TELUS says 1 p.m. Call to order. The Finance, Culture, and Economic Development Committee for March 7th, 2018, and it is, as we've just discussed, 1 p.m. And I'd just like to remind all committee members, if there is any conflicts of interest that come up in the agenda or during the discussions, that you will recuse yourselves and let others know why you're recusing yourselves on a particular issue. So we move then to the adoption of the agenda, which was circulated, and motion to adopt. Thank you, and thank you. And any additions or deletions? Anything from staff? Any light items? Okay, all those in favor? That's carried. And we move then to the adoption of the minutes, which were for 2 weeks ago on February, much more than 2 weeks ago, February 14th. And motion to receive and adopt the minutes. Thank you. And do I see your microphone on? Okay. And then I'll look for errors and omissions. Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. Question on page 6, third last bullet. Talks about the pedestrian path across Wharf Avenue near Daphne's and the Old Boot Eatery, and it says it's not included in the Wharf Avenue Sidewalk Improvement Plan. The previous plan that came before us actually had it included, so I'm wondering if it is included or not included, and if we get that clarified.
And to staff, if you can answer.
We have a separate budget for the capital works for designing Wharf Avenue. So that time we will include that the crosswalk on that. Not in this.
Will be included in a capital plan that's specific to that. Any other errors or omissions? Seeing none, all those in favor? We've adopted it at council already, have we not? Anyways, receive and adopt. All those in favor? Any business arising? Moving on to new business items. Item 6, and we have a report from our communications manager on public input. Motion to receive the report. Thank you. All those in favor? And we can turn that to Ms. Rogers, communications manager. Would you like to speak to the report?
I will just briefly. I know that each of you have probably expressed concern that the E-Town Hall meeting was not live streamed as we advertised. Whether we choose to live stream or not to live stream isn't the issue. It's that we did choose to live stream, and we told the community we would live stream, and so that is a disappointment. It wasn't something we could have avoided. There was a piece of equipment that just didn't work and had to be sent off for replacement. Going forward, will it happen again? It's entirely possible that it will happen again. It's technology. Technology sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. We've put a number of things in place that hopefully will mitigate it going forward. We don't believe it was a huge loss to the community because we did the backups in terms of we still posted the the voice recording of that meeting. We were still receiving questions through the website, through social media. We still responded to all of them, and in some ways we did a better job. So rather than saying to people, oh, well, the video's there, go ahead and scroll through it and see if you can find your answer, we typed up all of the answers and posted them to the website so people can find in writing the answers to the questions. So it wasn't an ideal situation, but I think we rose to the occasion and managed to get the information out anyway.
Thank you for that. Any further questions of the report or comments in terms of, I was going to ask what we thought of the actual public engagement side of it. It was about 20, 25 people that were fully engaged in the budget. Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just on page 9, this is about attendance at the conference, UBCM. What wasn't mentioned that particular evening, that was several councillors have decided not to go to UBCM this year. Okay, and that's part of the reason why the professional development is where it is, at least partly. And the other one was on page 12. It was about the proposed 7.7% tax increase and how much is going towards capital. And we said approximately 150,000 or 2%, and I believe it's probably 3%. At least in the next report, it's 3%. So I don't know whether we need to correct that someplace or not, but just a couple comments.
Where is that on page, did you say 12 or 13?
Second last question.
Yeah, and I'd look to the Director of Corporate and Financial Services. That seems to be inaccurate.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yes, actually, unfortunately, the response doesn't answer the question asked. It's probably a 3%, 225,000 going to capital. The 2% of the 150,000 is actually the transfer to surplus, which is over and above the transfer to capital. So unfortunately, this question isn't answering, or the answer isn't answering the question.
And the answer to the actual question would be
3%.
48%.
3%.
How much of the proposed 7.7% tax increase goes towards the capital? Almost half. Correct?
If you looked at that, yes, sir.
So let's get the answer right with the details that they really want to know. They want to know how much of our upcoming tax increase is already built in, well, almost half of it, and that's $225,000, 3% of the total, and 2% of that percent, well, actually, 150, whatever the math is going into surplus, so they can see how it's going into two different places. That would be a good improvement, and we can get that up on the website. And it might be useful in the ongoing answers to the UBCM and conferences in general question is that, as Councillor Wright points out, this is a discretionary fund, and in various times in various years, if individual councillors don't feel it's beneficial to go to UBCM, they actually make that decision not to go. And if they feel there are other conferences that are more valuable to them as councillors for the district of Sechelt, they sometimes ask to go to those instead, but the total budget is for education and professional development so that councillors can do their best work. Councillor Seekers.
Thank you. One of the couples that was here at the E-Town Hall meeting actually expressed at the end that they were surprised to see such a small turnout, such a low population engagement. So what I'd like to challenge staff with is in the future, next year and on ongoing years, that we look at how do we present the budget in such a way that perhaps it's more transparent to people, maybe let's find out why they're not engaged and see how we can get them engaged so that we actually get more input and more feedback on how they'd like to see us spend their tax dollars.
Thank you for that. I think it's a good idea, and it'll come up in a mirror image this evening at the council meeting when the SCRD presents their budget. And my question tonight will be, and when does the public respond to your presentations? I don't think the SCRD has even the first step we've done, but we can work harder. to get people engaged. And Councillor Inkster?
Yeah, just two comments on the comments previously voiced. The first one about the UBCM, this year was one of those Vancouver conferences, which is interestingly enough, that's a huge hit usually on that overall budget, but it is still interesting that it was half what was budgeted. And we've seen that over a number of years. It's rare. You know, I don't know what happened in looking at that budgeted item from 2011 to 14, but I know previous to that that was underspent by quite a bit. And in terms of the interest in our budget deliberations and that, I think it's since the district's been the district of Sechelt rather than the village, I think we've always been searching for how we can get more interest in the budget process. I guess even though Mr. Stewart's excited by it, sometimes many people aren't necessarily excited by financial figures.
Well, we'll look for ways to continue getting engagement, and if nothing else, big tax increases every year will soon get their attention. Is this being live streamed, just to be sure? Thank you. That's good. Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, the same couple spoke to me at the beginning of the meeting, and they said, well, where is everybody when I walked through the door? And it was quite funny. I said, this is usually about the attendance. We'll get about 6, maybe 8 people at the very most, and they were very surprised. I certainly agree with trying to engage the public in it, but if I compare our success to round 2 budget at the SCRD, there was 2 councillors present for round 2 of the SCRD budget, and nobody bothered to show up till there were several presentations by organizations after lunch. So there was nobody there other than 2 councillors. So I guess we're having moderate success by comparison. Not that that's a high bar to meet, okay? But I think we need to do that improvement as well. Thank you.
Thank you. It's clear that former Councillor Douglas Hockley asked a sensitive question, because we've had lots of people responding to it, and we'll work on engagement, not just for the budget, but for everything we do, and we do have some others coming up. Anything else on item 6.1? We're okay, thank you. And now we move to item 6.2, motion to receive the report from the Director of Corporate Financial Services. Thank you, Councillor Seegers and Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? And we'll turn it to the Director, and who will help us through parts of it, and then we'll see how we approach looking at some of these changes.
Thank you, Your Worship. So the report in front of you, first just detailed the process we went through to get to here. All the information I'll be talking about today, in fact, the next few weeks, is information that has been presented to this committee, was presented to the public during the town hall meeting. Essentially, my thoughts would be that today we would look at the general fund operating budget, which essentially establishes the tax increase. Next week, we can start looking at the capital budget. It wouldn't necessarily affect taxes unless you wanted to actually reduce how much was going to the taxes or capital, but really more of a prioritization of projects. Then we'd start have a quick look at the sewer budget, which we haven't talked about too much at this point. And then the final meeting would likely deal with the allocation of the taxes and sewer levies among the various population groups within the district. So today I thought we would go through the operating budget, the general fund. I could do a quick run through of the impacts on the budget, and then I guess essentially turn it over to the committee to let me know how you'd like to proceed.
Thank you. We'll look forward to your sort of review of the changes, which, as you suggested before the meeting, we had seen at least once before, but it's good to be reminded. And I'll just give a heads up that when we get to turning it back to us and looking at the additional operating items, there's one more item that I'll look to see if there's an interest in adding for discussion and consideration regarding Oceans Day. And I'll explain why that just came up. So back to you to take us through these pluses and minuses and explain why there's more pluses than minuses.
Thank you, Your Worship. The first item on the list here is the salary and benefits. This is the increase required to pay the current staff that we have with the negotiated wage increase with our union staff, through some reclassifications of staff, et cetera. Total cost is about $156,000 or approximately 1.97% tax increase to fund that. So I say this is the current staff we have, no additional staff. The next two requests are for staff increases. First one there for $90,000 is an arborist horticulturalist. Actually looking for someone that has arboriculture and irrigation skills to work in the Parks Department. At this point, they haven't had an increase in 10 years, I believe, or one increase in 10 years, and a fairly large increase in the inventory of parks, trails, beach accesses, et cetera, that they maintain. The next position is for an equipment operator. This is more of a general position for the Public Works Department to deal with peak issues and vacations, and really just to provide additional staff to cover, again, their increase in work that's come along in the past 10 years. They haven't had an increase in 10 years either in their staff. The next item is a review of bylaw 430. That's our subdivision and control bylaw. This is really what helps development services and engineering determine what the requirements are for developers as they want to develop in town. It sets the standards, and the idea is to really look at it to make sure that the standards in there are what Sechelt would like to have. Considering the change, I believe it's been quite a number of years since that bylaw has been reviewed. The next item is debt costs. These are short-term borrowing costs for two capital items in the 2017 budget. This was the repair of the roof and the backhoe that was purchased. This would be a 5-year payback for those two short-term borrowings, so a total of almost $80,000 for those. The RCMP contract, this is based on a 4% increase. Hate to say I'm still trying to get the actual budget from the RCMP and have been unsuccessful, but I believe there's been some communication issues, perhaps with the change in staff over there. So at this point, it is a 4% projected increase in their budget for the contract, but I haven't been able to nail down that exact number yet. The next one is an increase in information technology costs. This is actually all the software licensing fees. One of the bigger ones was our Microsoft Office cost to ensure we were in compliance. We did an audit. We had to increase the number of users or annual fees for that. So that had about $9,000 or $10,000 impact. And the rest of it really is just the software costs for all our major systems. A lot of our software vendors are now going to annual licensing fees as opposed to buying the software. It's more of a rental if you want. So it's a better business model for them, but harder on our budgets. The next one is the general election. This is just a projection of the cost based on what the previous election was, and then using some inflation to try to determine what this election would cost to run. The next one is the 1% revenue. So this is an increase to taxes because it's a reduction in the revenue we receive from the utility companies. TELUS and the Shaw and Fortis pay us a fee based on the revenue they earn within the district areas, 1% of the revenue they earn. Seen a steady decline on this. The real issue is because from the telephones, we don't get any percentage from cell phones services, only from landlines. So as landline services go down, we're seeing that revenue decreasing as well. The next one was an original proposal to increase the community investment program. The committee did, and council endorsed to keep the grant as where it was. So this is certainly, I kept it on here primarily for consistency between what you have seen previously and where we are today. So unless the committee doesn't wish to actually put more money into the bank for this, this can be removed from the budget as an increase. The next ones are reductions. These are all the credits. So this is the good news side of things. First one is the downtown Wi-Fi. Council last year agreed to hand the Wi-Fi over to the SDBA to run, but we would cover the maintenance costs, the software costs for 1 year until they were able to get it up and running and find a revenue stream for them. So with this $10,000 was in the budget as a one-time expenditure, so it's coming out now. You will see as part of the additional requests, they're actually asking it to come back, but I'll deal with that when we get down there. But this was the original budget as a one-time expenditure. The next reduction is in training plans, approximately $10,000. This was just us looking through the training budgets all across the district and being a little more tight on what people could do, and we were able to reduce the budget by about $10,000. The cell phone charges, this was a new contract that was signed with TELUS in 2016, and this is essentially the benefits of going to, with that new contract, we were able to reduce our cell phone charges by approximately $14,000. The next one is another reduction. This was reduction audit fees. We went to RFP for our audit services, and MMP was a successful bidder for the next 5-year contract, and their contract was about $15,000 less than what we'd been paying in prior years. The next one is the reduction in the tax subsidy for the airport. This is with us attempting to start leasing some lands. We've got that watertight building, and there were a building used to be owned by, or leased by Watertight, so we refer to it as that. It's an empty building that we're looking to lease. With that revenue, we can get the tax subsidy towards the airport operations down to zero. And so this is that reduction of what was in the budget is the tax subsidy for that facility. One of the miscellaneous changes, when we go through the budget, we look at every line item. We try to see where we're spending money, where we're not. And if we're seeing a consistent budget where we're not spending those dollars, we reduce it. There's no impact on service levels. It's just no need to budget for it. So we do diligently look line by line. And through that, we were able to reduce about $45,000 out of the budget. The next one, the development permit fees. This is just an increase in revenue based on the recent activity in our permits and fees. We've seen our engineering fees, actually it was about $300,000 in 2017. We're budgeting $200,000 for that now, just in case that was an aberration, but it's still $70,000 higher than it was in the previous year. We're also looking at some of our development permit fees, and we're seeing an increase in there. And again, we're budgeting $120,000 for that now, which is an increase of about $20,000 for that one, and that's really just based on the 3-year average. So if the development activity remains as it is, we do project we'll be able to get this additional revenue. The next one's a reduction. This is a transfer to surplus, so it's really a budgeted item. Right now, we have an operating deficit overall of about $450,000, and we really shouldn't be in that position. We do have other reserves, so from a pure legal perspective, our equity is still in a positive position, but the money that's earmarked is unallocated surplus is actually overdrawn if you want. So I certainly would like to see us get that to a positive position. This would have us budgeting a surplus of $150,000, and ideally we would start to build that up. My ideal situation would be we'd have about 2 months worth of revenue in reserve, in a surplus, simply to deal with unexpected emergency items should they come along. And the final one is taxes from growth. So this is the offset to all these increases. So other than the tax increase, we did see an increase in our assessed values of about, assessed values, increase in our growth. This is new construction of about $56 million, which generates about $180,000 in new taxes. So through all that, so our general operating increase in required revenue is about $370,000, which would be a 4.7% tax increase. And then added to that, as the mayor was speaking to earlier, as part of the capital renewal strategy started last year with council, is to ultimately build up, be taxing for the depreciation for our assets. If we had done that as one shot, it'd be about a 60% tax increase. So the goal would be to phase it in over time. So we're doing, proposing a 3% tax increase, which would allow us to have money in the bank when our capital assets need to be renewed. So the idea wouldn't necessarily be to spend it every year. Right now we are, because we started at zero, but in the long run, the idea again would be to build up some reserves. So when a roof needs to be replaced, you do that 1 year, another year it might be a major road repair. But the idea is to have a relatively steady tax revenue and have the expenses fluctuate depending on the capital needs from year to year. So continue with that strategy. We've got a 3% tax increase again for this year. So that brings us a total property tax increase of 7.7% as proposed. And so we go on to the additional items at this point, or stop there, Your Worship?
Let's stop there and then come back to additional items. So for the committees, do you want to go back to the top and see what questions and concerns we have as we go through? It's probably the easiest way to do it. Any questions on salaries and benefits? Questions about the, oh, sorry, didn't see that. On
Thank you.
salaries and benefits.
I don't think we've actually had an opportunity to go through this actual financial plan draft, which informed these numbers. So I do have some questions around some of the service or the salaries from various different program areas. So I'd like to bring those forward.
That's a good place. Okay.
Okay, so in a number of areas, it indicates in the book that there are no service level changes, and yet it does indicate either an increase or a decrease to the full-time equivalent. The first one is on page, so this might just be staffing moved around and reallocated to other areas, but that the service levels will still be maintained. So on page 76, with regards to administration, it indicates a 0.5 FTE increase. And then in building inspection, it shows a negative 0.5 FTE decrease. So we decreased it there. Development services indicates a 1 full-time equivalent increase, and financial services has a -1 full-time equivalent. So I'd like you to comment on that, and then I have some questions about some of the numbers actually affiliated with those.
Especially in the context of no service level changes. So if finance can do with one less person and get the same levels of service, and planning is doing the same levels of service, but they need an extra person. It's all good question.
But the other question, at the bottom of the page, in the reports, for example, on page 76, at the bottom it says service level changes none, and yet it indicates that they've increased a half of a position. So I just see that they don't quite tally, and I'd like some explanation for that. Thanks.
Would I look to finance for that, or?
Primarily, unfortunately, I don't have a quick answer for you. It really was some type of a reallocation of staff. In the bylaw area, there actually was 2.5 FTEs budgeted in there. We had a half FTE that was ever filled, and that was moved over to create the executive assistant position, which was only budgeted for a half FTE in the prior year. So one position was filled, but only had a half FTE budget. The other was vacant, so it was really aligning up the budget between those two.
So can we just stop that as an example then? So the service levels in bylaw didn't change because the two people were there and the number of calls for service, but clearly the service level associated with the EA would have changed because we now have a full-time EA. So it's an allocation within the district, but a shifting of where those activities are taking place. Is that correct understanding?
That is correct. And certainly on the bylaw side, that half position had never been filled, so we just kept it where.
Okay, so there was an increase in the admin office in terms of the EA, and they funded that through a surplus in another area. Okay. And then the other questions?
So on page 76, then, under administration, would we expect to see a service level change reflect an increase in service, given that category, or not?
I wouldn't say it was a service level increase. Really, prior to that, we had other staff that were just working extra, covering the job, and really filling a role that was being done by others, but not perhaps as efficiently as it could have been.
Okay. Okay, I'll leave that piece now. I can see Councillor Wright has his mic on.
Well, did you want to finish up on the development and planning? Because I think they were looking for that as well. So, second half of your question. And what it points to me is that we perhaps need a discussion of service levels and whether or not at this point in the organization we actually have good objective measures of service levels in various departments. And that'll come up when we look at the next two in terms of an increase in whether the business plans, and I'm sure the business plan could be made, but whether it does actually make the case on the basis of objective measures of service as opposed to, well, over the 10 years we got more of this, so we need more help, as opposed to actually measuring through the various changes that have actually taken place. Kilometers of roads or parks or whatever.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to go back. It just seems, I mean, it is a reallocation of staff. We did certainly, and my first guess is that we did have a manager in the engineering department. Certainly, we originally had proposed a manager of engineering services that was split. And then it was felt that we actually needed more support in the engineering services department. So that position was kind of consolidated into that department, but it had been split around. So that's probably part of it. We did the same thing in planning, but unfortunately, I'm not seeing a change in my numbers here. I've got my list of staffing and I'm getting the same numbers and that, so I'm having a hard time. So I will have to get back to you on those increases.
Okay, and anything else on the general salaries and benefits before we go to the specific asks? Anything else on general? So there's two general sense of, we know there was reordering in the planning and development area, and it's just a matter of trying to keep track of that. And it may be as simple as the fact that the directors in place or the senior management team thought that the allocation of available resources should be slightly modified, plus here and minus there, but that's just to clarify for Councillor Seegers. And then we go to the next, another question on salaries and benefits.
Page 95 in the book. So here we're indicating that we had a reduction in our building inspection, and yet if I look at the 2017 adopted budget, 187,222 for salaries, wages, and benefits, and yet the draft budget for 2018 is an increase to 193,451. So if we've reduced staff, I'm wondering why the budget has increased that much, given that, I mean, I know we have an increase in wages. It might be tied to, if you're saying that that position was never filled, then that would make sense in this. But if we went from 2.5 to 2, then I'm questioning the increase.
I'm sorry, we have to look into that as well. Certainly, as I say, the numbers are flowing. My report actually only shows the two, so my report seems to have been post these changes, so I'm not getting the original numbers to be able to look at it.
So you can get back to us on that. Thank you. That's all
fine.
on
Anything else
salaries and
on
wages.
salaries?
No.
Okay. And again, it's likely, we know that the building permits have risen, so there's additional costs associated with that. It's just a matter of identifying for the councillor where that's coming from. So we move on then to, let's do them separately, the arborist horticulturalist. Director Wright.
Director Wright.
Sorry, committee member, Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Your Worship.
My head is entirely immersed in regional district this week, unfortunately. So.
When I look at page 214 in the book, it shows a new position, 0.75 of a position, and this is in sanitary sewer operations, so it's at the Water Resource Center. And it appears that we've moved the operation manager's position, or a portion of it, over to the Water Resource Center, because there's a reduction on the third line down. And I guess I'm having some difficulty with, I got a new 0.75 of a person at the Water Resource Center. I got a request for an FTE horticulturalist, and I got another request for an FTE equipment operator. And that's 3 positions all in one department. Well, Public Works and Parks, if you split them, it's 3 between those two. It's 3 new positions. I understand there hasn't been a position added there in a long time, but 2 things crop up for me. What changed from 2017 to 2018 that made us add 3 people? And the second question is, since you already moved the money to the 0.75 Water Resource Center, I guess you must have thought that was the most important one. And if that's true, I'd like to know that that's true, because that helps me make a decision on the other 2.
I may defer to our Director of Operations to answer the specific questions. Certainly one of the Water Resource Centers, we haven't really talked about too much. It's actually the Dusty Road septic site is where
That's
we're
right.
looking at. And primarily because of a work safe issue, we have to man that position now. So it was deemed probably the most important from a safety and health and safety issue to allow us to receive
I
all.
I understand, fair enough.
But just for clarity, that shows up in the budget book, but it doesn't show up in the slide that's on the PowerPoint right now.
No,
Because it's not a request, because it's already there and it's just a
It was
short.
going to be brought up, this slide is dealing only with the general fund.
Okay.
And so that's a sewer-related position, so it would have been brought up next week as a discussion point.
Okay, just so we can follow.
Yeah. Well,
So do we have a more
okay, then
general
I'll go back,
response?
then I'll go back to my question. What is, on these two positions, what has changed from 2017 to 2018 that all of a sudden we need an extra FTE? The number of parks hasn't gone up. The number of beach accesses has increased by 1, I believe. And so if we manage to do all of the parks last year with the current staff, then what's changed that means that we need 1 more staff this year? And I understand the 10 years no staff have been added, but I'd like to know what that change is.
Sorry.
Yes, I'll combine my comments for both positions at this time, and then we can expand further. Being here for only 12 months and looking at how the operations and the parks proceed and the requests that are coming in, and in the infrastructure that we do have to maintain and administer and make sure that it's safe is becoming a bit of a concern. Because again, with regarding our parks and you know, beach accesses and stuff like that, there is a demand for safety issues. There's a demand that we respond quickly because these areas are being utilized extensively from the public. So we have to make sure that we respond to that manner. What I've seen in the short time that I've been here, it's being done, but it's not being done efficiently. Our levels of service are being lowered. We are getting more accesses. We are getting more stuff like that happening. And that is a burden on staff. Regarding our infrastructure is aging. And of course, we're trying to increase the longevity of that. So the roads are deteriorating to a point, you know, potholes appear, and we've got climate change, we've got different things happening. And again, we have to respond to make sure we can increase those assets as long as we can. So that response time, because we're being stretched, it's taking a little bit more time. So you get more deterioration in those roads and in the ditches and stuff like that. So that's what I'm seeing in the short time that I've been here. So the additional people that we could get would provide us to bring those level of services up, protect our assets, and extend them. And I will have our staff speak as in the past.
Further comments on that? I mean, if I got the gist of the answer, it was in the estimation of the director, there's been understaffing over the period of time. So even though service levels haven't objectively changed, your reading of the workload and how things are being managed requires additional staff. And I guess we'd like to get to a point where we actually know that service levels and staffing are right flatlined, and then we can actually measure service changes and staff changes. And it sounds to me as if we're not there.
We're not there, no.
But then how? And so directors are suggesting we catch up, and councillors are saying, where's the evidence that we need to, because things were okay in the last year. In fact, we get a lot of praise for both of these areas as opposed to complaints for service levels.
And that's due to dedicated individuals. You know, a lot of overtime, spending that time out there, you know, making sure that everybody is safe and can move around, you bet.
Will overtime be reduced
I believe so.
by $90,000?
I can't comment on it.
Just,
Well,
Director Wright would like to continue this.
well, I have, you haven't convinced me about the overtime would be deleted yet, but I guess, Your Worship, that's exactly where I was heading, is if we don't have a service level that we can measure against, then how do I know I got any improvement? You know, I mean, if I've got a painter and he paints one building or one room a day, and I add 2 painters, I'm going to get 2 rooms a day. Well, now I measured it, and I can say to the community, well, we hired an extra painter, we're getting 2 rooms a day painted. If in parks, we cut the parks once every 2 weeks, and I add 1 more guy, am I going to get the parks cut once a week? Everybody can see that. And that's what I need to be able to measure. And the mayor is right. We get compliments, not that you should change the way you're operating, about both these areas. And so I'm just having a hard time balancing that.
Okay, I think what I would say, and committee members will make the decision on these, is we have done, in the last 3.5 years, we've put in place a great number of new system and planning and administrative measuring devices, from the financial sustainability plan on through, and even Visio that we're going to look at later. We haven't completed that in terms of tightly measured and fully understood organization. So there's work to do, and that's part of what is underlying this discussion. It's they understand the requests, but we don't understand the measurements in the business case. So we can leave this for now, and we'll move on to a couple of others. And I actually got 3 people ahead of you. Oh, sorry. Unless it's exactly on the same point. Okay. So I'll turn to Councillor Seegers, then Councillor Mueller, and then Councillor Shanks.
Thank you. Question with regards to overtime. Are our staff paid hourly or are they paid a salary? My understanding is most is salary.
No,
No?
they're hourly.
They're hourly. So we actually can determine how much we pay in overtime.
Oh, yes.
Okay. And that has an impact on staff as well, like with their quality of life as well, right? I mean, if they're dedicated, great, they do amazing work, but they also need to, I mean, safety gets impacted if they're stretched.
Yes. Even with snow removal, there's only so amount of time you can be on a truck before you have to take the person off. There's other issues, of course, with the, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And Councillor Mueller.
Yeah, thank you. This is more of a process question, could be answered by either the chair or the director. I'm most interested in discussing the global picture, and I'm just wondering where in this discussion we're going to get to that, because we could go into the nitty-gritty of all the operational details. That's not exactly what I like to do from a council chair, because obviously there's an expectation that our staff are working with the best efficiency and finding efficiencies and doing that, and we have great staff, so I trust that. But I do want to get into the global picture at some point, and we haven't been able to do that so far yet in this deliberation.
So I think there's going to have to be a balance as we look at individual items and see how that adds up. And by global picture, do you mean talking about the 7.7% in general terms?
The big picture, tax increases, state of reserves, state of the finances in a total picture.
Okay. And I'll turn to the Director of Corporate Services and when that broader discussion will emerge, and or if it's actually started in some degree, but not total.
Your Worship, yeah, I would say it really has started in some degree. As far as the operating side, really the discussion about increasing the surplus to eliminate that deficit is on the operating side. The only real discussion on the reserves, as part of the capital plan, I was going to go through a list of what the reserve balances are, how much we're drawing from them, and where the balances of those are. So my intention was to bring those forward next week as a global picture. I certainly have some numbers now if you want to talk about them, but I hadn't anticipated that discussion on the reserve side of things.
Okay. We appreciate you trying to make it manageable for us, and that is appreciated. I think part of the issue, and it comes out from Councillor Seeger's first comments, we got these complex budget books. Most of us worked our way through them when they first came out in the first 2 to 3 weeks, but we didn't actually have a workshop on that book and taking us back through there, which would have been some of this broader discussion. So staff are trying to put it in manageable bites for us, but we also have to recombine that at some point to say, well, despite agreeing to all the small changes, the 7.7% needs discussion. How do we reconcile those things? And that's where Councillor Mueller is going. So further process questions?
And that was kind of what I was coming to. So in the process, then there will always be split, the capital and operation side discussions. So we won't be able to, at this point, discuss the big picture and how they relate.
Well, in many ways, because I went with this idea of the strategy of increasing the tax portion that's going towards capital, and that was sort of its own decision to increase that by 3% a year. That's what's going to be driving the annual tax rate, if you want. At that point, the amount of money available to capital has been set. So if you agree to this 3%, we know how much money you've allocated towards capital. So then the discussion on capital would be the priorities of the projects, which ones do you want to do? Do you want to save some money? So I sort of separated the two in my own mind. Perhaps I hadn't expressed that as well.
Well, I just want to ensure that we're going to have some point during this process to deal with the big picture, because, of course, if we were to say we'd prefer some large-scale changes to operations in order to affect capital, at this point, we have no way of doing that.
I'm not sure if we both understand, but if we want to make changes to operations, today is the time to talk about that and the increases or cuts. And if you then wanted those changes to be allocated to capital, which would be a significant change in our financial sustainability plan, then that would be the second part of the conversation. Yes, I want to make these cuts. I want to see operations go down because I want to fund more into capital. The reverse doesn't work as easily. We can't start cutting capital and putting it into operations. That is part of the problem that got us to where we are today, is that over the years, people did sort of steal from capital reserves and patch things over as they went through. But operating is our flexible budget and tax increase on an annual basis. This is the place where if you want to see that allocated in different places or not allocated or not taxed, this is the place. This is where the flexibility is. The flexibility on the capital side is only which projects you do. It's not going to be, unless you fund it from here and actually.
That's correct, Your Worship. Unless you wanted to increase, if you were to
Increase
reduce
this
the
even more.
operating to, 2.7% and take that additional 2% and add it to capital, that would certainly be, your prerogative.
So maybe as we have come down to the end of this, we'll come back to that question that you're posing and see how that fits.
Thanks.
And Councillor Shanks.
Yeah, I just had one question. I thought
It's on. No,
I was of the opinion that we already had an arborist on staff. Do we not? We do, but not a horticulturist or?
to staff.
Thank you. We're fortunate enough to have an arborist on staff, but that's not his title. This person needs to be compensated and recognized for what he's doing. So this is one of the reasons that we're asking for an upper end position. I could have been more straightforward and I wanted to be completely transparent about this, and I could have asked for a labor, because that's essentially what it'll boil down to. But by asking for an arborist position combined with irrigation and horticulture, this person would essentially be my lead hand, and it would trickle down, and we would see the addition of a labor at the bottom end. But right now, the arborist that we have, his position is actually a horticulturist, and I'd like to see it redesignated as an arborist and recognized as such, and also included in another huge part of his job duties at this point, which is irrigation.
So just to cut to the chase, and this is really useful, we're talking about basically a promotional position to recognize the professional development of somebody over, say, 5 or 10 years who's now acting and contributing to the district at a certain level, not recognized, so let's do that. And as that is more fully recognized, what you really want to increase in terms of service levels is the labor position at the other end, which I'm sure even Councillor Wright would follow that through differently than how it was. So I'm glad you spoke up.
Thank you.
Let him ask the question.
Pardon?
I'm glad I asked the question.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked the question so we can actually see what this is. So am I correct in
You're
identifying this as
perfectly put.
okay,
Yeah.
professional development over a period of time? Does that help everyone? That helps. Okay. So this extra additional money will go in a couple of different places, basically some to raise somebody to a lead hand, and some will end up being another position at another level.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I've made it complicated,
you
but I
didn't.
wanted to be perfectly transparent on my request.
Yeah, efforts to be transparent made it more complicated, but that's good. We're glad. And I saw Councillor Seegers, I think, next.
Thank you. I'd like to address Councillor Mueller's question. And I'm wondering if inside of the process that we're doing here, if we're looking at operations today, if we could actually deal with all the operations piece on the information you've given us here, we could potentially leave the property tax increase for capital renewal until we talk about capital, because that will impact this as well, and then we could have that global discussion. Or we could have all of it today, but it'd be nice to actually have the capital discussion with this piece incorporated. So we wouldn't actually finalize our operating budget today, but we'd get close. And that would be, look to staff to see how you want, or council to see how you'd like to deal with that.
Did you follow that?
I do, and I think, I mean, you're right, and certainly changes will be made all the way through until we're getting close to the bylaw. I just thought, and I guess we looked at the funding increase of capital, the 3%, going with that assumption that council was sticking with that plan. The current capital plan incorporates that increase in there, so it was really beneficial today. If that number was being changed, we could then spend the next 24 hours redoing our capital plan if the funding wasn't there to match the plan that I'll be bringing forward next week. So it becomes a bit of a chicken and the egg. If next week you start to add to the taxes, you know, I'd have to then look at, or reducing taxes, it would be which capital projects do you want. So it really, we can go either way you want to do it, but it's...
I'd be very disappointed if in the very first year of a financial sustainability plan, we said, oh, we're going to change it because we don't want to be sustainable anymore. So let's try not to even entertain that. Okay. It's just year one of a financial sustainability plan that we spent a lot of time last year understanding going forward, and took some political risk in putting forward for a 20-year period. So let's leave capital renewal and financial sustainability where it is, and for now, unless it's a real, I mean, it would be like an abrupt left or right turn. I don't know which direction, but it would be a 90-degree or 180-degree turn. So I see Councillor Wright, and we're still dealing with these two staff increases, and he's probably hoping he gets a simple answer on the equipment operator one as well.
Thank you, Your Worship. Getting back to Councillor Mueller's concern, my concern, the 3% for the capital renewal, I'm okay with. I can defend that. And I'm not about to make a right turn on that one.
Okay. Double right.
I guess where I'm going is I need to look at these items so that if I'm going to be looking at a reduction here, I know where it's going to come from to reduce the 4.7. And that's sort of where what I'm looking at. So will we need to purchase a vehicle for either one of these two people, or a piece of equipment this year or next year? So I won't see a new truck coming along because I'm going to be asking that question if I'm here. If you had a choice of one of these two positions, which one would it be? That's the decision I'm going to have to make. And I don't want to make the wrong one, because if you leave it to council, they're going to say this, and if that's not the one you need, I don't want to do that. So I need to know which one is a higher priority than the other for this year.
Yes, that's a very difficult answer to give. And I must be honest, because again, when I look at both operations, they're very distinct. And there is sharing right now of staff, because we help each other out. We're moving around all the time. If that comes down to it, the best thing to be is to have an individual in each department. However, if it's brought down to one, I would say we would hire one full-time and divide the time up to both departments. One full-time FTE.
Carry on, yeah. Oh, sorry.
But the question is, would you hire the equipment operator or the arborist? Because they're two different numbers. One's 90,000, one's 75. I just need to know which one is the most important to hire.
Again, I couldn't answer that at this point. I'd have to do some more.
Okay, just as an aside, we wouldn't expect Perry or John to answer that question.
No.
But directors are paid the big bucks so that they can do that. Okay.
Well, the difficulty
And it is hypothetical. It is hypothetical, and it may in fact not be the case. You may find that there's full committee support for both. We don't know that yet.
we don't know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
On the equipment operator, and we don't have a motion to reduce either one of them at the moment, so just to remind you.
Info. Like you said, you need tracking. We've been putting city works and stuff in plan for the last few years, and we're using it more and more. So that gives us our tracking of our hours, of our jobs. Just even with the service requests that come in, out of average 800 a year, 72.5% of them are for public works. And that's above and beyond road maintenance, ditching, all the other stuff that I have to plan for myself. With snow removal, it's whatever happens. We can't forecast for that. You know, it seems to start at 7:30 on a Friday morning all the time. And then it goes through, and that's where overtime kicks in. Overtime kicks in, it's double time. With the bodies, I have 147 kilometers of road now. I don't know what it was 10 years ago, but you have to times that by 2 because I got to plow both sides of the street. 11 hours maximum, MOT rules for the drivers. I have 4 plows, and then I got 5 guys. So the numbers and keeping up with the service requests are getting more demanding. Maintaining the service level, we're not. It's not that we're not trying, but you got bodies that are starting to break down and they're getting tired. And, you know, you show up at 6:30 in the mornings when my guys do, and at 3 o'clock, you can see them. You know, sometimes there is no lunch because we got to get this job done that way. If you see them driving in a truck eating their sandwich, because that's their lunchtime, driving one site to another. And that's getting more and more. You know, I have a let's get it done attitude because of my background, but you can only push people so far. And I don't think it's fair. We need that extra help.
Okay, thanks. And I see Councillor Mueller's light on.
Yeah, so I mean, same question, but a different type of thinking, because we're going to have to reconcile the global picture. And I'm not going to ask my questions about that, but if I were to ask you to find an efficiency in your department or to cancel an area of service so that we didn't have to raise this, what would that be?
And I think that wasn't just rhetorical.
That goes for almost every area of operations, because we have to look at it.
So we did agree to keep service levels the same, but what's coming out is we're not clear as a committee what those service levels were, and we might not have been clear as a committee what we agreed to when we said to keep service levels the same. Because when we said keeping things the same, we probably didn't expect a 5%, 4.7% increase to do that. So that's just so that staff are aware of what we're going through. And I think we thought if we were keeping everything the same, the tax rate would be lower than this.
And to be clear, I don't expect an answer to this right now. It's just that, as the mayor said, we agreed to keep the service level the same, not knowing that the bill would be this. And it's a little hard to swallow, frankly, but that's not a reflection on anyone's work. What it means is that we have to shift our operations. There has to be shifting happening. There has to be, we can only find so many efficiencies. We have to shift what we're doing, our areas of work. It's plain and simple. To me, anyways, looking at this.
Thanks. I don't think many of the other ones will take quite as much discussion because we do understand FTE increases. But if we could move to the next one, the bylaw 430 review, $80,000. Oh, not quite. Sorry. Yes.
I have to say that I'm having difficulty with these increases, but there's so much I don't know as a councillor. I don't know how much contracting out has happened in these departments. I don't know the overtime. I don't know sick time. And I think all of those things are the things that our operation managers are aware of when they make these requests. So there's no way with the information I do have that I could vote against this. I would vote in favor of both.
Thank you for that. And I see Councillor Shanks.
I'm moving on to the third point, Alice.
Okay.
And it would be my suggestion, in view of what's been happening the last year or so with regard to developments and insurmountable amount of development happening, that this particular item could be postponed to 2019.
The bylaw 430.
The bylaw
River.
430 review.
Okay. And Councillor Seegers, and then I will comment on this one.
And I would argue otherwise. Bylaw 430, my understanding is we took it from Langley and brought it here and put it in place. If you look at the topography of Langley compared to our topography, there are a lot of things in Bylaw 430 that were not anticipated and not incorporated. It's also old and outdated and not clear given current standards for the developers that come in. So it's actually causing issues for our staff, issues for our developers, and slowing down the process because there's a lot of ambiguity that needs to be addressed. So I would like to see this worked on, cleaned up. I think it would streamline a lot of things for the developers and our community.
Yes, thank you for that. There is this urban myth that the original one was snuck over here. It is a pro forma bylaw 430, and it looks standardized compared to many across the province. I also think we need bylaw 430 because it's slowing down the growth and development and the vision of our community, that we're actually trying to create a new community, and we don't have the bylaw tools to do it. However, I'm wondering why it would cost basically one full-time person or one full-time person 9 months, $80,000 to actually review something which is substantively complete and has been under review by various senior staff over the last 3 years. This was virtually ready to go in September, Labor Day of 2014. There was reasons why it was pushed back, and this council wanted it to be reviewed again, but I know it was reviewed by the interim director in 2015, and it was reviewed again more recently. So could somebody explain why we need, are we contracting it out, or like at what, which has also happened at one time. Previous council actually hired somebody specifically for development and to do this, and then they hired a peer review to review it. So there's been lots of review. It's in pretty good shape. Can somebody on staff explain why we need this much to get it over the hill? We want to get it into that, we want to get it in front of council. It's going to cost us $80,000 to do it.
That number reflects a normal consulting fee with an engineering company to do a review and a rewrite. That would be a fairly standard number. I'm not aware that this thing has been reviewed several times and that we have a new bylaw ready to go. So if that was done by Nikki Hogland or somebody else, I'm not aware of it and I haven't seen it.
I've been informed that I may be I'm thinking of the zoning bylaw, which is 530. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, the zoning bylaw is coming along in a minute.
Okay, and 430 is engineering? Subdivision. Okay. And it would be engineering. Okay. Not the one that came from Langley. Okay, thank you very much for that correction. I'm glad that councillors were listening closely enough to my concerns to know that I was on the wrong path. Anything else on this one? Debt costs, pretty hard to control. RCMP contract, did I hear you say it may actually change?
Yes, Your Worship. The number may be a little different. I'm hoping not too much from what's projected here. So I've included a 4% increase.
Thank you. Information technology. Licensing costs and, yeah. General election, unless we go to acclamation. Yeah. Utility. I did some quick math on this. I couldn't believe, if this is 1%, that utility is gas, telephone, who else do we get? Hydro we get something from?
Hydro and Shaw Cable.
And Shaw Cable, which is means there's only $14.5 million worth of revenue from those sources in the district of Sechelt. which comes at, with 10,000 residents, it's only $1,450 per resident going into their revenue streams, and that seemed low.
No, this is the reduction, the 1% reduction.
Just the reduction.
Yes, in the total revenue.
So they're losing $14.5 million worth of revenue, or they say they are.
Correct. From their landlines, they're probably generating twice as much on their cell phones.
Hydro's going, I mean, my hydro bills are 50% more than they were 3 years ago, so.
They're offsetting.
No, I added the zeros. Yes, probably do. Yep. Mayor's going to have to start paying attention. Increase in CIP grant. Any questions on that? Pardon? It's gone. And then we look at things like the Wi-Fi, training, cell phone charges. These are all reductions. We can only hope that they were larger. Additional revenue from development permits and fees seems reasonable. We're obviously in a transitional phase for real estate right now. Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. Since we've come to the downtown Wi-Fi, could you explain the taking away 10,000 and increasing by 8,000? What is the request?
Perhaps ask my IT manager to come explain what the $8,000 would cover.
I'm not sure where the 8,000 is. Work though? Like I know what the numbers represent, but I'm not sure where you have it. $10,000 is what we put in last year to continue to maintain it. This year, we didn't get as much progress as we wanted last year. They've asked us to continue to support them this year. That's the Downtown Business Association. The numbers that it works out to is closer to about $7,500 for the software, and so the software licensing is about $6,000 a year, and the Eastlink data internet feed is about $1,400 a year. Those are the two pieces. Licensing might not include tax, so that's where it gets up to those numbers. So that's where the $8,000 is coming from, that they're requesting for support to continue it this year.
So to the Director of Finance, this is just a bit of confusing. You could have left the first one, downtown Wi-Fi, as a reduction of 2,000 and not had both a decrease and an additional request. Or did you want us to look at it as a request in case we don't want to do it as an additional?
That was the intention. The $10,000 was a one-year commitment to support the Wi-Fi while we hand it over to the SDBA. They've asked us to support it for an additional year, and I certainly wanted council to have that option to decide if they wish to do that or not.
So, Councillor Seegers, can we wait till we look at all additionals at that time? Okay.
So what I'm hearing the request is that we pay the operating costs for maintaining the Wi-Fi downtown. Are they still going to take over running it? And if so, why is it not coming out of their operating budget if that's the agreement they made to take it over?
So they are still planning on running it, and they had hoped to have their business model in place where they were self-funding it through advertising and a bunch of other pieces. We had a few problems last year with it. The local business that had a support contract to maintain it and was going to be really involved in the hand-holding between me and them and that transition of knowledge and operating knowledge, that company went out of business. And that's the reason for this 8,000. It's actually probably more like 7,500 that they really need. That's the difference between that 10,000 and that 7,500 was that annual maintenance fee that we were paying to a local IT company. So that company's gone out of business, and we've struggled in getting the Downtown Business Association with the training and support that they need to be able to run with it. And they don't want to launch it as a downtown service until they can address the reputation. It has a little bit of a reputation of not being reliable or stable. The numbers don't match that. I mean, it gets tons of use. It gets like 1,500 users a week, and it's had, just in the last 6 months, it had over 600 gigabytes of data usage. So it's definitely being used and leveraged a lot. But there's a few people that have made a lot of noise, just a couple people, in my opinion. I've only ever had 2 people complain to me, but the same 2 people have complained a number of times. So the Downtown Business Association needs more training and more handoff on it, and then they should be able to run with it completely. Just didn't happen last year.
It sounds like they don't have it built into their budget to manage the operating costs from their budget because they were looking to have it be self-sustaining.
I believe so.
And that's why they're looking to us to maintain it for another year so that they can wait for that year, work in this 1 year to get that business model running.
Because they don't completely understand it. Like, they're trying to wrap their head around it, but it's, there's a few pieces of it that they're challenged with. One of the alternatives I'll throw out there is that if the council's not supportive of continuing to maintain it, one of the other options is we could continue to provide the Eastlink internet feed, which is really the root of it. That's in our building, and it's a dish up on the roof. That's about the $1,300 a year. And then the network wouldn't go down, it wouldn't break. But the Aerohive maintenance piece, that's something that has to be paid. They may be able to negotiate something with Aerohive or reduction or forgiveness or find the money for that in their budget. I don't know, but I wanted you to know it's not an all or nothing for the system to keep running.
Okay, I appreciate the comments, but we will look at this as an additional operating when we get through the current one, and we'll want to weigh all of the additional ones together. Anything else on the changes from 2017 in the general operating fund? We saw all the increases, we went through those in some detail. Is there any of the reductions that people want to? And the surplus is an additional taxation in order to balance the budget.
Not to balance the budget, actually is a surplus, so we would be generating an additional $150,000 in revenue versus our expenditures, but we have an overall operating deficit, so it's to get that deficit.
So it's to balance the operating
Our accumulated deficit to bring it to a surplus,
Okay.
hopefully within 3 years.
Okay. Anything else on in that 4.7% change?
So my question is about the surplus then. Moving forward, is that number going to change? You're going to stay relatively static year by year?
I would recommend just keeping it at the $150,000, so there would be no tax increase for the future. It would just be a budgeted $150,000 surplus. So you're seeing an increase this year, and then it just holds from that point forward.
Okay. And in your mind, that takes care of the operational deficit?
I believe it does. Within 3 years, we're at zero, and then it starts to build up. So again, I'd like it to be higher, but to get us to the financial position that I'd like us to be would be outrageous. So it's a plan to get us there. Within 5 years, we would start to build up a good surplus. 3 to 0, and then start going from there.
But isn't this, maybe I'm not understanding right, this is a money in, money out scenario, so if we're putting the same amount in, each year the percentage is changing, or is it the same?
I just use $150,000. It's really not, this isn't a change from 1 year to the next. So once it's in the base budget, it would just continue to be in the base budget as a $150,000 transfer to our surplus account.
And that covers an operating deficit that's fluctuating from my knowledge of being here. It moves around. So
yeah.
You would have a better handle on the numbers, but I just want to make, that's a big piece for me to know that there's an additional fail-safe in there.
It will be eventually. Within 3 years, we would be at a zero.
It just seems small was the direction of it.
It is, but relative to all the other increases, it seemed to be a prudent move to do a small increase at this point and hold it steady there.
So just to clarify for the public and ourselves, the operational deficit we're referring to is the fact that our full operations are not fully funded on an annual basis through taxation. We're trying to work towards that, and this is one of those steps. Is that correct?
No, it's the accumulated surplus. If you approve the budget as is now, we would run a surplus of $150,000.
Okay.
So we would have a profit of $150 for 2018. And next year, if we kept exactly the same budget, you'd have another $150,000 surplus. So we'd have $300,000 in the bank. Because of prior year decisions, we're actually at a deficit, overall deficit position. If you think of a private company, that's the retained earnings. Mm-hmm. We're in a deficit position of $450,000. So by earning a $150,000 profit for 3 years, we will get that retained earnings accumulated deficit back to zero, and then ultimately start to build it up to a level that we would deem appropriate. And my suggestion would be somewhere around 15% of our annual revenue.
Okay. I may need to see the page that has that deficit on it. on some statement somewhere, wherever it is.
And then
And
just,
let you
if I
follow.
could, just follow up on that point. The global picture, however, though, if we include the capital side, is much worse. Is it, in your mind, this is not meant to cover that? We're gonna have to deal with that through other means.
Yes, this is the operating deficit, if you want. On the capital side, we are funding the projects, I think, that are needed. There's probably some deferred works that are being delayed just because the money isn't there, but, so they are, I'm treating them as two completely separate discussions, if you want, as far as how much we should be funding for capital versus now, we're fully funding our annual operations. It's just, this is getting us, I said, back to a even position from decisions from prior years where we were actually drawing and spending more than we were making.
Thank you.
And Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. So I'm just trying to get my head around this as well. So what you're saying is that our budgets each year now are basically a balanced budget. We're bringing in and spending what we bring in for operating. No surplus, no deficit. We're bringing in and spending the same amount.
Yes, in 2017,
Yes.
we budgeted to make about $2,000 profit, so very
Right.
minimal. 2018 budget has us actually operating a surplus of $150,000.
Right, so what was funding the operating deficit in previous years? Was that from?
We were drawing
reserve?
from reserves
From
to
reserve-
cover our
operating reserves.
operations. Yes, we were drawing, yes, we were, yes. we were
Every
spending-
available reserve.
Okay, so we were drawing from operating reserves. So what is the status of our operating reserve at this point? We have none.
We do have operating reserves. If you looked at it, we've got, there's the police reserve, there's the list. And this is where, on the financial statements, you're not going to see it is, we have a provision for assessment reserve. Some of the big ones here, the community building reserve, the crime program, these all have balances in them. The problem is if you add up all the reserves, they add up to about $1.7 million, but we only have $1.3 million in the bank, which is how we end up with that deficit, right?
Okay.
So as a whole, if you add up all the reserves, we're at a surplus, but
Okay, and the reserves that are there are specified for particular categories.
generally they have been, yes, in the past. Some are equalization reserves. I've been trying to do some research into some of these reserves and where they came from. That some have been static for a number of years. So I've been trying to get the research to identify what the initial intention was.
Okay, so can money in various operating reserves move from reserve to reserve?
Those ones, yes. It's council's prerogative. These are not statutory reserves. So it's simply earmarked money that council has said, take this money and put it in a reserve for a specific purpose, but council can undo that decision at any time.
Okay, so in 3 years, if we did 150,000 each year, we would actually be, our books, what are showing in our books would actually be what we have in the bank.
Yes.
And then after that, we would raise 150,000 each year to go into a general operating reserve.
Correct.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
Thank you for trying to take us and the district through a straightening process. We're left, unless I hear recommendations otherwise, with changes to the 2017 into the 2018 budget as outlined, which will give us a property tax increase of $371,000 and a 4.7% overall in revenue. Is there any responses to that? People want to suggest changes, or should we move on and comment?
Just wondering where I should add the request or request council's entertainment of a request for Ocean State.
Next.
Next.
Yeah. If we're moving on to additional operating items, and there's no appetite, and I didn't hear Okay, then we're looking at additional operating items, and we have a list of library grant, downtown Wi-Fi, seniors planning table, community forest annual dividend. And over the last 2 weeks, we heard from and realized that the Oceans Day event that was started last year in 2017 as a one-time out of community investment program, I think. We expected to be funded through a staff proposal in communications, and it didn't happen because of the transition of retirements in November, December, right when all these things were being done. And so we'd like to add, if committee agrees and Councillor Mueller moves, an item under additional operating items, which would be Oceans Day event and 10 grand. What did we do? What did we do last year?
Last year was $900.
$1,000 for consideration for 2018. $1,000? I started there, but I just realized we didn't. Okay, so moved by Councillor Mueller. Anyone else put that on the table for us? Thank you, Councillor Lutz. And just for consideration, it doesn't mean we've adopted it. I just want it to be considered with the others as we go through it. All those in favor of adding it to the list at this point? Okay, thank you. So we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items to consider, and one of them being the library with several sections to it. The library was considered a little bit out of sequence last, while I was away, I understand, and there was some support for providing some one-time capital items, but I didn't really follow the whole story. It's now back in front of us in terms of the regular process when we would consider it with other additional operating items. And you can see we have 4 options outlined. I wonder if the director could walk us through that. I remember the report because I actually read how you had taken the library's request and broken it into various one-times and capital and what you thought would be options. So could you just remind us how you came to some of those options and what they're based on?
Yes, Your Worship. So the numbers you're seeing here would be the district share of the increase the library is requesting. I can find the numbers, but just so you're aware, this is approximately 63% of their request. So the requested amount is the total that they brought forward primarily to the SCRD. They did do a presentation to us, but the SCRD request was a little more detailed. So I pulled that together. So their total request was for all the items they wanted, including some capital items, some community outreach, some staffing changes. I went through it, and the option 2 is really me looking at what I think, what were deemed to be capital or one-time items. So it took out the staffing increases. I removed the ones that were increasing of their collection, primarily because that was part of their contract. So I felt that, you know, if they hadn't kept up on that collection, it's not really a one-time thing, it's a catch up on their budget. So that was sort of my estimation of what would qualify as capital or one-time expenses. The library had indicated to the SCRD what their priority items were. There was a bit of a disconnect because their priority items were some of the staffing increases that were attached to some of the hardware they wanted. And option 4 was just that the Venn diagram that said which projects fell within both options 2 and 3, which was considered quite a minor amount really overall. So that's where those numbers are coming from. As I discussed in the original report, I feel the things that are in option 2 would fall under the MOU as classifying as one-time or capital items if the council was to consider doing that. The challenge with it is if it's under the agreement, we really need the agreement of the other 2 funders as well. Certainly it's within council's prerogative to just give a grant to the library outside of the contract if it wished. If they wanted to do it within the confines of the contract, we'd have to be looking at seeking funding from the other funders. And maybe I can add to that. I understand that from the SCR.
I was going to comment on that. Yeah, that's good. And just before I go to Councillor Seegers, and I'm glad just to say that in round 2 of the SCRD budgets on Monday, they reluctantly declined to provide any additional funding, and then went on to praise the library in fairly good terms. It was an interesting display of action and words. However, I'm glad you identified the option that we could provide support for the library if there was willingness of the committee, but it would be outside the MOU at this point. And I guess we wouldn't know precisely what the priorities of the library would be if we agreed on any one, even option 4, because this is only 60% of their funding for those options. So they'd have to come back to us and tell us how they would spend X if the committee. So that's the context. Councillor Inkster. Oh, sorry, Councillor Seegers was first. Oh, okay. Councillor Inkster.
So if we go down that road, I mean, we already have a tight budget, but we previously said, well, it was a tie vote in terms of making sure that they were in order in our budget discussions, you know, based on the year that we're looking at here. And you know, I could entertain it. They give us a list, and sometimes you end up picking pieces from that, which some on council don't like doing, but I'm okay with that in terms of dealing with some of the needs that they have. If we do that, go that route, then the strange thing that happened the other day, I thought they would make a motion to have a contingent on our grant. So what's going to happen if we do step up is they haven't. And it speaks to the comments I made the other day about how many years ago, I shouldn't even say many, a few years ago, the district was stepping up for a number of capital expenses at the library. So once again, if we do this without a regional matching, in a sense, based on the agreement in place in terms of, I guess it's an amount per capita or usage, it's the DOS stepping up again to fund library extras. So,
in the midst of an effort to get it stabilized.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
so
difficult.
I mean, I'd like to.
Councillor Wright.
Well, thank you, Your Worship. Well, I guess the other thing, putting this in the context of budget, is any one of these things that we add increases the 4.7% increase in taxes, which increases the 7.7%. So I guess, while I might support some of them, and might even want to go ahead with some of them, I have to look at that 7.7% increase and go, do I want to be boosting that by another 2% or 3% or 0.5%? So that's going to be the difficult choice that we're going to be faced with.
Yeah. With one caveat, I would say, which is the final item, the Community Forest annual dividend. It has, every year the Community Forest has been fortunate to give us 2 dividends, one of them a $25,000 plus or minus dividend, and one of them the legacy fund. The $25,000 one prior to 2017 always went into general revenues. It didn't in 2017, and so we could, and that is actually sitting in the legacy fund where it shouldn't be. So we could spend $25,890 on one-time items for 2018 that would not affect the budget. We can do that without a tax increase. So that's the play money, if there's any. Without a tax increase. That's right. That's right. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to suggest we have about $25,000 that we can actually disperse without touching the tax increase. And I have suggestions on where I'd like to see that go. Councillor Mueller.
Yeah, it was when we discussed this in theory. It was just in theory the other day because we were all the recommendations were hinging upon support from our other partners. Now hearing that we don't have it for any of these items, it kind of outside of the MOU, it makes that difficult to entertain. And some of those things were very. You can see how there's a demonstrated need for the capital items such as computers and whatnot. That is the best dollar value spent in that library. Well, I think hearing that, we're going to have to refer this, in my mind, to the MOU discussions. And if it's going to move forward, we'll move forward with our partners.
Anything else on the library, just so we can move past that? Councillor Lutz and then Councillor Inkster.
Thank you. I too feel without the partner support, even that 25,890 wouldn't do any one of those projects without even a partial increase to our property tax general. So I'm afraid I can't support this. I think we have to wait for the MOU when all the partners will be at the table.
Thank you for that. And Councillor Inkster?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the dividend, and that's just differently, in a sense, worded and designated than the extraordinary one, which we don't seem to talk about, which would help a number of things, especially in this year. And we've been given an indication that it's going to be a little bit bigger this year. So those are things that we could look at. I wanted this to go back into sequence to discuss, and I think we should take a serious look at some of those things. If in fact the directors didn't fund it, the information will go back to them, and they were told it was just out of sequence. We didn't say no. We said we wanted to talk about an overall budget. It'll go back to them that I'd like to see us fund a couple of things, and then we look at the MOU, because there are some identified capital things. That's why we're funding our own capital expenses going forward in terms of putting money forward for things, because they have some things that need replacement, and we have some things that need replacement. And it will go back to them that we stepped up for the library. Why didn't they?
That's a potential option. I remember reading the minutes and thinking that in fact there was not simply a vote on the process, but a vote on expenditures. There was actually both went on in that meeting. So I think that the first time it was a split vote on spending, so it was defeated, as there was a split vote on, well, there couldn't have been a split vote on the process. There was some discussion of that. So where are we left? I'm hearing three people actually saying the MOU is the structure for this, and that we'll simply get out of the efforts to stabilize funding if we step forward. And I'm hearing one person suggest that putting some one-time money to the library would be a gesture of positive support. Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. I would like to give additional money to the library, and given that our librarian has given notice and is leaving at the end of May, I don't think this is the time to do that. So we could be generous and give money to them, which they would use, as I said, previously, for our vulnerable people. But there's going to be a changeover in the library. I think we should keep it out of this, stay out of it right now, and bring this up when we go to the MOU conversation, because we'll need to address both operating and capital inside of that. And those conversations should be starting fairly soon.
Okay. I'll just hesitate to see if there's any more on the library. We have downtown Wi-Fi, seniors planning, and Oceans Day. And again, we're trying to keep in mind that these are comparative, and money we spend on one won't be spent on the other. Downtown Wi-Fi, we've had a good explanation of where that is and why it's not in the SDBA's budget, and why they would look for us to carry it forward one more year. And we also had a suggestion that we could keep the Wi-Fi alive in a very small base, i.e. in this area, not on Olive Cowrie, if that was also preferred. Any committee? Councillor Seegers again.
I guess I question, what if we were to put half of these funds in? That would give them 6 months to get their partners in place, move things forward. I'm wondering if that would suffice.
And if staff can answer that or not? Yes or no?
Maybe. The Arrowhead licensing, when it expires, it's a 1-year license. So they're going to have to come up with the funds to do the renewal on that. Sometimes they'll allow them to hold off for a few months. The system doesn't break if you don't renew your license. But if a piece of hardware goes down, you can't log in and fix it. So if we pay for the internet here, it does take care of all of Cowrie Street. So it does still continue the entire mesh network. So half of it would allow them to continue on definitely paying for the Wi-Fi, and they might be able to, I think they might be able to get by with half of it, but it doesn't allow them to do the proper renewal of the license, because it's a set amount.
And Councillor Mueller?
It's tough because this particular item has been struggling for a home since Seashelt Innovations, the days of Seashelt Innovations. I think that the Downtown Business Association is likely the right place for it, and if it's not found there, that it doesn't have a home, because those are the people that they're running businesses, they're benefiting from it, and if they can't seem to find the money to pay for it, then I don't know why we would.
Okay. Any other discussion of the downtown Wi-Fi?
I understand it was a process, process issues in that the people supporting it were not around anymore to support it. And so that the implementation has really been set back. So we're looking at providing them a little more time to bridge to be able to take this on themselves. It's not just the businesses downtown that this supports. Again, it's our teenagers, our students who have, cell phones but don't necessarily have Wi-Fi. Again, the vulnerable people in our community who need access to Wi-Fi to be able to use their phones and their access. I'd support the 8,000 for one more year, but let them know it's one more year and that's it.
Can I speak very briefly to that? If they don't have it taken over by next year, then I am not in support of continuing this next year. I am in support of it this year because I understand what happened over the past year, and I see the usage, and a lot of citizens are using it. Even though the Downtown Business Association isn't doing the metrics and the different things that they can do with it, they are getting a bit of a take on it. After this year, I wouldn't support it this year. I do think it's a good thing.
Follow up on that? I'm asking if you wanted to follow up. Okay. And then I'll go with you.
Thank you. So if we actually look at the numbers in front of us, the increase in the CIP grant has been taken out. That's 12,300. So if we put this 8,000 in, it actually doesn't increase the percentage that we're looking at in this budget at this point. So I'd see reallocating those funds.
I don't think we all followed that. I'll come back to a minute to the director and then ask our CAO.
Beverly, could you try to explain for everybody that if we gave them $10,000 last year to take this over, what were the steps that they needed to do in order to take it over, and why would that not have happened, other than a software renewal?
They needed to learn how to use the network. We needed to turn on analytics. That was one of the pieces, is we can see the traffic, so we can see how many people are in the different areas of the downtown core. We can't see anything information about the people, but we can see how many devices are moving around. So and that was one of the big pieces of their model of supporting it. So they needed to learn the system. The people that were supposed to train them on the system went out of business 2 months into our transition plan. So we did do quite a bit of work on getting the hardware upgraded, but and updated and creating a plan for what they were going to do. I didn't have very much time to support them. I did a little bits and pieces, but with Rapid Edge closing, there was no one to hand over. We do have a plan. We have 2 people that know the system very well, 2 third-party contractors that have been paid to do a transition plan to help them get on board and get trained on it, but it just didn't happen last year for that reason. I didn't have time to train them, and there was no one else available.
Was the $10,000 spent?
Most of it was spent. Yeah, it was on the hardware renewal.
Okay.
The $2,500 that was to go to the local contractor was spent early last fall on another third-party contractor to help with this transition process, but they haven't been available to put the time in yet. So we've been in talks with them this month.
So I'm actually very much in favor of downtown cores having Wi-Fi for the people who are using it, and I think they are the vulnerable and less fortunate as opposed to those that are running around with expensive data plans. But we've been limping this along for 4 years, and I'm getting really tired of that. And in the priorities, I'd rather see, I want to make sure there's money for the next item. And just That's where I'm thinking of this. So I don't know if it's the priority or not. Some of the money, a certain amount, but I didn't follow why the $12,300 change above, which is a 0.16, would somehow neutralize the $8,000 here. So could somebody explain what Councillor Seegers was doing, thinking we could end up with no change to the 4.7?
Well, I guess following Councillor Seegers, and I probably would have made this change unless I heard otherwise, but the assumption that the increased request for the CIP grant of $12,300 was essentially denied when council only gave them the early approval for the $52,000. So assuming the committee doesn't need any more funding, because actually they don't plan to meet again this year, that could be a reduction of the 7.7. So by taking that off, just play with the numbers now, we'd be down at
We'd actually have $4,300 additional.
Correct. If you have 12.6, if you add the 8,000, it's a net relative to those two projects.
Okay. Thank you. I have a motion to support the downtown Wi-Fi for $18,000, knowing that we're in fact going to 80,000, with the understanding that the increase in CIP will not go forward. Thank you. That's first and seconded. Any people understand the math here? Any further discussion? It's going to be close, actually. Yes.
Just to be clear then, the reduction in taxes that Mr. Stewart just spoke to is not relevant then? We're going to spend it instead.
The CIP that's in the top part of this page,
Yeah.
was still left in as an increase in CIP. In fact, it's not going to be an increase, it's going to be a wash. So it's zero.
Okay, and we're not putting the difference back to the reduction in taxation. We're moving it potentially to this program.
Yeah, that's right. Potentially to this program.
Well, I'll keep a running tally, so you're at 4.64 by doing that move, or 7.64 overall.
Okay. Any further discussion of support for the downtown Wi-Fi for the next year? All those in favor? Any opposed? Okay, that's carried. Then we go to the seniors planning table. We've got some material in front of us. We've had a couple of presentations over time, and in large part this is to carry forward and complete a number of the recommendations from the, what was it actually called? The project that they completed for us through a grant and the age-friendly plan, and including collaboration. I think we get an awful lot of bang for our buck on this, so I would support it, but not for the full $25,000. I would think $20,000 would be closer to what we can actually afford. Councillor Seegers, and then Councillor Inkster, and then Councillor Lutz.
Oh no, I'm good.
Thank you. I've sat on the senior planning table for the last 2.5 years that it's been in operation. It's been doing good work. They represent and support 50% of our population, because 50% of our population is 55 plus. So they do amazing work. They did put forward a request for, I believe, $50,000 for a coordinator to keep all of these various balls in the air and keep things moving forward. I have brought this to this council for the last 2 years for support. I will support this, but I have to say I find it a little suspect that it's now coming forward in an election year and being proposed. But I will support whatever funding the rest of the council will support.
Any other comments, Councillor Lutz?
Could you remind me who else helps fund this group? Is it only the district?
there's no fixed funding for this whatsoever, and that is one of the questions we had before in terms of trying to make it more of a regional function, but that hasn't happened. It's been very difficult, as we all know. There was a suggestion that they used the model that the Housing Advisory Committee first used, which was a MOU for 3 years through the regional district. That was not supported.
Right. I too think they do excellent work, and there is the need, but it bothers me that the fund will be used for a coordinator. That means it's ongoing, and I really would like to see it have some more stable support, but I'm willing to go with 20,000.
Councillor Mueller? Sorry, thought it was on.
I can't actually recall the last time that this item came up and was discussed. So it's not that it's new. It's a shame that it's coming in this form at budget time, just to discuss about funding. We could have talked a little bit more about the relationship that we wish to have with this group moving forward. And I think that's really what needs to be spelled out here. These one-time hits of money, this seniors planning table began just to take advantage of a grant that didn't come from this government some time ago. So it wasn't our impetus. And I do believe they do great work. And as the mayor said, it serves over 50% of our population. It's just we need to define exactly how we're going to deal with this in a more sustainable way so that they don't come in as these random hits at budget time that don't necessarily come out of any strategic direction from council.
Thank you for that. I'm just reading the letter. I'll probably want to correct one. But Director Wright. Councillor Wright.
Thank you, Your Worship. I would support the $20,000. I know last year at budget time it came up, and it was the number was considerably larger at that time. And I know there was some discussion last year about giving them $20,000 to move forward with some of the work that they're doing. So I'm quite prepared to support that. I don't think it's an election issue. It's something that we need to do, and this year we need to find the money for it. And I'm sure that the seniors planning table will they'll probably leverage that into something else with the regional district and possibly with the town of Gibson. Thank you.
And Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. The seniors planning table actually came out of the progress plan, and it was what, 250,000 that you guys got for that Status of Women grant?
Closer to 300.
300, okay. So 300.
Over 3 years.
Over 3 years, yes. And out of the progress plan, they, one of the initiatives was to bring together the various groups up and down the coast that support seniors and work on collaboration to leverage the different groups. When they initially came to us for funding, it was, yes, it was in response or looking at a model that was used for housing, but another model that's actually being used is the same for youth. So currently there's an MOU between the various governments to support youth initiatives. And we don't support seniors, and yet they are the majority of our population. So we could potentially, we can fund them here, and I think they will then, as Councillor Wright indicated, look to leverage those funds to go to the other governments to see if they can actually get sustainable funding ongoing, which is what this piece would be in our budget, to support the seniors initiatives.
Okay, and I take that as also a suggestion that we could work on reviving the idea of an MOU with the other governments at an intergovernmental meeting or something of that nature. Just in passing, I note the letter on February 19th. Second sentence actually says, Mayor Milne suggested the SPT could have $25,000 sustainable funding. I've actually never been able to find the place for sustainable funding. I'm disappointed. It's always been ad hoc and one year at a time. But I'm afraid that in my mind, I don't know where the sustainability side of this would come from yet. So, and this one time was actually because of a misallocation by our director and accounting department of where they put some money. I thought, well, that's but that's not sustainable. That was, because they're not going to make that mistake again, or that allocation again. Councillor Mueller.
So I just wanted to be clear then, is this request for a standing grant or is this one time?
This is just it's one time. And Director Stewart.
Sorry, just based on your comment, maybe I should clarify something. It's actually the next item down there, the Community Forest annual dividend. This was essentially a budget error. So it is an ongoing thing. We get that grant from the Community Forest every year. So it would be added. So just from a funding perspective, I put it here just so, again, I didn't add it to the 7.7 list that you saw previously. So it is, if you're looking at that side of it, so you're right, there's the 2017 money that went to reserve that shouldn't have, but for 2018, the budget does not include this either.
Does not include
this. So that line, I would say it is really need a vote. It's really pointing out a budget error. It really should be moved up into the
okay, yes, it should be above that.
Into the base budget. I just wanted to put it there to let you know that I didn't want to hide it. I mean, the other numbers there because it was a new item that hadn't ever been addressed.
So in 2018, 2019, 2020, when this money comes from the community forest, would it normally from now on go into general revenue?
It would, and be available.
That's all I need
granting,
to
yes.
know. Yeah. So there was a budget error when you.
It was a budget error.
Further discussion. Well, I don't see all the lights on here. So.
I win.
Okay. Well, Councillor Inkster is actually sitting there too. So let him go first.
So just to be clear, this particular amount that was proposed, 20,000, seems to have some good support. It's a good idea. Could come from the Community Forest annual dividend that's sitting there. Is that what we're looking at?
If you want to track it that way, yes, because that money was a budget error, so it's actually a surplus that wasn't spent in other places.
That's fine. I'll track it that way. I don't want to increase taxes, so that's where I'll take it from. And I like doing that because it means that we don't have to necessarily have increases in taxes if we find additional sources of revenue. So I'll support this, and I hope that it's coming from there.
Yeah. But the link may not continue. That's all.
We'll have to put something in place in the meantime, I hope.
And then Councillor Lutz.
Our funding for the youth committee comes out of traffic fine money?
No, at this point, all the traffic fine money goes to reducing the cost of RCMP operations. So that money for the others comes all out of taxation.
I'm thinking about the memorandum of agreement that we have with the SCRD around the youth funding the drop-in centers and some of the other things for youth.
Just speak loudly. The memorandum of understanding is no longer in place. It was not renewed for the last couple of years.
Okay.
So instead, though, District of Sechelt continued its commitment to funding that program by providing a multi-year grant, otherwise known as a standing grant. So it's actually funded through CIP.
Is there room for standing grants around this issue? Because we have in the past not had a dividend. And for that to come up, if we are promising funding, I'm a little concerned.
We've always had an annual dividend of 25,000. We've not always had a legacy dividend.
There is one here.
So I think even back in 2008 and 9, I was surprised at your comment that the traffic fine money goes entirely to the reduction of RCMP services, because I also thought it went to special services, the Justice Institute, whatever, a number of different groups.
It was really an accounting change that was done last year. We essentially took the RCMP,
and put it
money,
into CIP.
Took the tax money, put the CIP, took the traffic fine, put it to the RCMP, because it is conditional money, where tax money isn't, so it just made it easier for the CIP committee not to have to worry about the nuance of the traffic fine money.
And going down to Councillor Wright and then Councillor Seegers.
Thank you, Your Worship. I just want to be very clear. Is this a one-time grant?
to the best of my knowledge, that's
That
what we're,
so it is so it is only this year that we're talking about.
so it's under additional operating items. So that's a good question, Mr. Stewart.
My understanding with the request was an ongoing commitment so they could hire a coordinator. Now, certainly, if the committee only wants to provide us a one-year grant and let them reapply next year, that's,
So if we did it as now, it would be no tax increase. What would it mean in 2019? A built-in tax increase, or could we do it on
well,
current?
technically no, because the community forest dividend, if you want
Okay.
to look at those two numbers together, the dividend is a budget error. If I add it, you've got a permanent $25,000, 18 going forward every year. This 20 could be connected to it going forward every year. So it.
Okay.
But again,
So that raises an important question that I don't know if we have time to clarify. No, I feel like it's a bit on the fly. And Councillor Seegers is next, actually. And then,
Thank you. On page 18 in the letter that we received, they are looking for sustainable funding. If they hire a coordinator, it'll be difficult to ramp everything back up, get all the committees, all the volunteers in the community back on board, not knowing whether or not they're going to be able to continue another year. I don't know if I'm actually in support of funding that is not sustainable. So that'd be something I'd have to talk to the committee about.
Councillor Inkster, then Councillor Mueller, and we may actually have to leave this one in abeyance as we sort out that final point. Councillor Inkster.
Yeah, I think it's important that we know that the expectation from what I'm hearing is continuous funding, but I think it's important that the group gets the message that we're willing to fund it right now. I think that we can look to other partners and other local governments over the next year to form a funding agreement moving forward, as well as within our own budget, because there's clearly some support from this council. If we start moving money across from the community forest annual dividend and then say, as I've said before, you could designate money from outside bodies, including traffic fine, to particular grants that are needed in our community, then we're doing it again. As Mr. Stewart has said, that's what we're going to do. If we pretend we're not doing it, but we're actually doing it, we're just going back to what I've suggested we should be doing anyway. So I just want to stick on this item. I think we should fund it from that this year, and then I think we should ask staff to work out a plan for years moving forward so that they have continuous funding for the coordinator that they're hiring for an important continuing project.
Wise comments. Councillor Mueller.
So we've got a couple things going around. I'm going to take what was said by our director to be what we're actually discussing, which is continuous funding for this item. Without our relationship with the seniors planning table being very clearly spelled out, I would not be in favor of continuous funding for this. It's unfortunate, but we have something that really doesn't mesh with our bundle of goods that we're providing to the citizens, and it's tough to say exactly what it's going to be. So I would not be in favor of our staff going after that unless it was very clearly spelled out and we had very clear deliverables, and we knew that on this end.
Okay, and I think that agrees with Councillor Inkster, and certainly agrees with me. We don't know the ongoing relationship or the terms of reference that would be necessary for sustainable standing grant or MOU at this time. So I would like to look at this as a one-time item, gesture, but with the proviso that we're trying to support this program, and we look at ways that can actually work and meet the needs of the District of Sechelt in terms of our mandate. So one-time item, which is how it was originally moved. Any further comments? And we're at 20,000, just so we know. Councillor Seegers.
I don't know at this point if I'd want to support it or not. I'd want to talk to the seniors planning table and see if we were to give them $20,000 with strings attached to it, that they'd have to hire a coordinator, not knowing that it would be ongoing funding if they even want the money. Because it's a lot of work for them to put in to relaunch this whole program that they've had on life support for the last year, with no guarantee that doing that work and putting all that effort in, bringing everybody in the community forward, if they're even going to go on. So I wouldn't even know what to vote at this point. I think I'd like to, consult with the seniors planning table and see if they're willing to take the $20,000 with the strings attached and what that looks like.
So I guess we can ask to those in the gallery, are you willing to have this move forward one step? Or would you prefer to say, wait until it's all in a package? Who knows when that's going to happen? My suggestion is we're doing the best we can to move this forward a step and put it in a position where there can be some work done and structural work done and at a broader basis, but we can't commit in advance to how those other discussions might go. We can't commit in advance to what other funding agencies might do. So we're doing the best we can. If that's not in your interests, tell us now. I mean, it's pretty simple. Yes, you can come to the mic. We've got about 3 minutes before we're going to be into our next meeting. And we still have $1,000 for Oceans Day. Thank you. Thank you.
That's a very hard thing to settle exactly like that. And so what I want you to know that's missing, that has been missing over the last year, is the connect with a community-based senior services. All the action teams had to be folded because we didn't have support. So we had two priorities. One was communication and collaboration, and the others was safety at home, which had 4 action teams under it. So that's what's missing right now. The seniors planning table is going forward as is with the communication and collaboration, but it's missing a big piece, and there's a question mark as to whether at the end of this year, which will probably be around the end of June, whether we would have to have a discussion as to whether or not we were going to continue at all without funding. So we've had this discussion before. It's hard to build up and think that we wouldn't get other funding, but it's very tempting to say thank you very much for your $20,000 in hopes that this council will go to bat for us with some of the other players in the community, like the SCRD and Town of Gibsons, to help us work through that, because I can tell you that hasn't been easy in the past.
I understand that. And it's also actually, I would have to discuss in other places, but that's not actually a model in terms of our advocacy with other governments and how that works. It might sound like that's the way it works, but it doesn't. So thank you for that. That gives us the other option, of course, if committee members would be simply to refer this until our next special finance meeting. And that would give people a week or so to think about things. Just refer the question and leave it.
Thank you.
Not trying to be difficult, just trying to help. And if it's not going to be helpful, lots of other places can use the money.
I would hope that the $20,000 would give the group the opportunity to do some planning and operating while they try and seek other funding. I don't know where you've looked other than local government, but I would think that a lot of the actions that could come out of this table could have an impact on some of the service providers, and I would hope that they would step up. We're $5,000 short of your ask, and I would hope with some push at the Community Foundation and others in the community that could be organized. But I really do believe this is a regional issue and should be dealt with that way. And I'll work to try and convince others of that.
Councillor Inkster, and then I'm going to ask if you want to call the question or whether you want a motion to refer.
Yeah, I thought this discussion was more about the 20,000 than the amount that were short of the original amount that they asked for in order to make a commitment. I'm committed to making a decision now to give the indication to that group that we're supportive of them, and I'm also committed to looking for solutions going forward. That's our job as a council. So to say for a group to say, well, and I'm not thinking that they're saying that, they're just looking at the options to say, well, we don't want the money because we don't know what to do in 12 months. I think that maybe the smart approach, or shouldn't say even, it's a difficult one to even phrase, but I think the helpful approach would be to say that we'll work with you with this amount to provide the service and the coordinating that we need to do, and we'll also work with you to finding some sustainable funding moving forward.
Thank you. Shall I call the question before us, which is on support for $20,000 for 1 year with future years to be discussed when we actually have stronger terms of reference and potential agreement with other funders. All those in favor? Any opposed? It was a long time to get there, so thank you for that. And quickly, if we can, before we adjourn, is there an appetite for a $1,000 grant for Oceans Day event in the same place as additional operating items? Councillor Mueller.
So moved.
Seconded.
So
Discussion of that particular one?
If I could speak to it.
And then Councillor Seegers.
I'm glad that we got this in and that we managed to figure this out before we got any further down to budget. We did the first one of these last year, and I think it was, for anyone who went there, pretty much a resounding success. It came together in 6 weeks, as it did. But in the long term, more what we're envisioning here, every year, all around the world, they celebrate Oceans Day. It's in the beginning of June, so for us, that's a summer month. And they regularly feature areas of and highlight oceans awareness, conservation, and a number of other items related to the ocean. If you think that oceans are pivotal and important, extremely important to Sechelt, I think they are, then I think we need to find a way every year that we can highlight that and make it a focus. It's an important part of our identity. It's an important identity piece, but one thing that we might not be considering is that last year we had a beach cleanup as part of Oceans Day. And if you take just that aspect of it alone, that at the beginning of the summer we go down with citizens and we clean up our beaches as part of a way of celebrating our beaches, that's worth it in my mind. And I think this, we don't know how far this can go, but $1,000 to continue having this along would go a long ways.
And just so people know, most of the money will go to part-time coordinator or volunteer in the events, about 25 hours. And Councillor Seegers.
Yes, I just looking for some clarification on this. I know last year it came to us as a last-minute item, and we funded it separately from the CIP program. So I'd like to staff or whoever around, what happened that even though we requested that it come forward as a CIP grant this year, that didn't happen, and we're once again looking at doing this outside of the regular process.
And I think there was some, and I'll let Siobhan actually probably speak unless Director Stewart wants to, but there was some, not everyone thought that it was sent forward as a request for CIP. That was my understanding, but it wasn't shared.
My understanding, Ms. Smith, we want to add to that, they didn't apply for it. So again, they could have applied for a CIP grant and it would have been adjudicated by that committee.
Yeah, some of us thought they were going to do that, but that wasn't their understanding and it wasn't their communications with our staff. So they have emails with former communications manager that took it in a different direction.
So I remember last year when they came forward, they actually laid out what the plan was, who was going to be in charge of that. So would we also be getting that information coming forward if we approve this, so that we know who's responsible for the spend, et cetera?
Yes. Yeah. No tax increase. Any further discussion? All those in favor? Thank you, that's carried. Do we need to make any formal motion on the overall package of operating changes that you brought forward, or you have enough clarity from our 2 hours and 5-minute discussion that you can take this forward into the next stage, and next time we see you, we're talking about capital?
Well, it's certainly, I mean, unless there's specific motions to remove anything.
Which there wasn't.
I would take this as what council wants us to do with the tax increase. I would move forward unless there was a desire to come back and revisit some of these
We'll
items.
hear from Councillor Wright, and I also want to remind, I was thinking of the Councillor Mueller's interest in having another discussion at some point too. So Councillor Wright and then Councillor Mueller.
Well, thank you, Your Worship. So what total number are we at for increase? Because I know you're keeping a running total.
At this point, 7.58, 4.58 operating, 3%. 7.58.
58. Thank you.
So the property tax increase is 4.58 for operations and 3 for the capital.
That's correct.
Thank you. And Councillor Mueller.
I guess this would be my place to make my plug that I made earlier, is that I find it difficult to support putting this to bed in its entirety when we haven't discussed the budget, the capital side, and we haven't dealt with the budget in its entirety. All of these items, both capital and operations, come from taxation. They come from the same place. And so in that vein, I have it very difficult to say that this is exactly what we're going to support moving ahead without having discussed the capital first. So I will be voting against it.
No, we're actually not going to have a vote on this, which is good, precisely for that reason. And we'll carry forward onto further discussions on capital side and others. And it won't be, we'll give as much instruction to staff, and then they'll bring forward a bylaw, which we will vote on. And I take your point, but we're not going to vote on this today. We're just going to bring it forward.
It was okay, Your Worship. Yeah, I could certainly follow the plan. I was thinking and almost bring this back around at the end, if that would be the idea.
And Councillor Seegers.
Thank you. So I'm just a request to staff. What is the next step? What's coming up to us next? Is it sewer? And on what date?
No, next week, we've got meetings scheduled for every Wednesday in the month. So next Wednesday was to deal with the general capital. Sort of a review of carry forwards, what's been approved, and then the items that would be up for discussion for you. And again, we'll look at 2019 if you want, and future years if you want to look at priorities. So it'll really be the general capital plan.
Including community requests?
The community requests will be included in there as well, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And then sewer the week following, and then probably back to this discussion.
Then back to this one. Okay. Councillor Wright.
So, thank you, Your Worship. So the last meeting would be the place where we would say, we want to reduce the budget by this amount of money, or is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Except by the time we get to the last meeting, we've had discussions of all the component parts. So if you want the component parts changed, it's useful to talk about them as we're doing it, which we did today. We adjusted them to some extent. I mean, we do want to see the whole package, but it's hard then to go and unpack it again. So, Councillor Wright? There will be other opportunities, but I'm just saying that when you build it up, then so.
Well, Your Worship, I'm not, the 5.78.
4.58.
4.58.
4.58. I would like to see a reduction of 1.58 in the budget. And I'll leave it to the administration as to where they want to take it from. I will not support more than a 3% increase plus the 3% that is going into infrastructure. And I want to make that very clear. I'm okay if the administration wants to do the changes. If they want my help through this table at council, I'd be happy to do that. But that's where I am, and I don't know where other councillors are.
Well, with all due respect, we gave them instructions on service levels. Staff and senior management did that work, came back with this, and asked for our comments on each one of those items. They had that. So you can arbitrarily say you'd like to say an unspecified 1.58% reduction, but they've come and asked us where that should be. So it'll come back again, and so we have time after today to think about that, but it's going to have to be specific, and we can't, we had the opportunity much earlier in this process in December at setting the overall rates and saying we would not support anything over 3% or 1% or 4% or whatever. We chose a service level approach, And that's where we are in this. So we can't change the ground rules in the middle of a process like this. Councillor Segers? Yeah, you may be voting against it.
Thank you. Maybe Councillor Wright would like to float a motion right now to see whether or not there's support on council for the reduction that he's looking to put forward. That would then give staff some certainty around where they're moving forward from.
And Councillor Mueller on that comment, because I
So
think you want
I,
to, that's why
I
you wanna see it.
appreciate that this is difficult for staff to deal with. Council having an issue with the total taxation. Also appreciate how difficult it is to chair a discussion with 15, 16 plus participants with so many line items. The difficult part for me is that it's March and we're having our first real budget deliberation today. I really wish this would have happened previously in last year. It would have been great. We could have got some of this more sorted out in a way that made us feel comfortable with it. Right now, I'm just not feeling entirely comfortable. I hope we find a way to get through it.
Okay, and we won't support the budget till we're comfortable and we know where it is. So points taken, I think, on all of that. Motion to adjourn the Finance Committee at 3:12. Thank you. Thank you. All those in favor. We'll take a short break before we come back to our next meeting.